So good afternoon, everyone. Firstly, thank you for joining us today and welcome to the fourth and final instalment of our four-part UK SOX webinar series. Let me kick things off with some quick introductions. My name's Mark Jackson. I'm the Practice Director for Turnkey's Integrated Risk Management Services in the UK. I'm really pleased to be joined today by our guest speaker, Julianne McGarry, someone who is a known authority on the subject of internal audit, risk and controls, and has extensive experience across those fields. She brings with her that rare combination of deep-seated theoretical knowledge, is also backed up by hands-on practical experience around putting these things into action and turning that theory into reality. So she's really well placed to give you some top tips today regarding practical steps that you can take to prepare for UK SOX. But let me give Julianne an opportunity to introduce herself. Over to you, Julianne.
Hi, thanks, Mark. So yes, as Mark said, I've actually got over 30 years experience in internal audit, risk and internal controls. And I've also had the privilege of operating at a senior manager level, actually within the business on the receiving end of all of this. I took a decision mid-COVID to have a change of career and to move into the academic space where I can do some more research and also share those 30 years of acquired knowledge and experience to the next generations of people working in the risk, the controls and the internal audit space. So back to you, Mark.
Thanks, Julianne. So before I hand over to you fully, some quick reminders regarding timings. The webinar will be approximately 20 minutes in duration. If you have any questions yourselves, then you can feel free to post them in the chat or the QA facilities during the session. I'll be taking a look at those and keeping an eye on them. If we have any time available, we can cover them at the end. If there's any that seem appropriate to bring in during the discussions, I'll do that also. However, if we do run out of time or we aren't able to cover all the questions, we'll get back to you after the session itself. So just please go ahead and post any questions that you might have on the subject. Also, just to make you aware that all of the sessions in this series will be recorded. They'll be made available to you on demand shortly after we finish the final webinar today. I believe we'll be sharing out links to everyone who's registered for the webinar series probably tomorrow onwards. So that's great. So let me go on to the next slide. And at this stage, I'll now the housekeeping's out of the way, I'll hand back over to you, Gian, to take it away. So over to you.
Thank you, Mark. Right, I'm doing something different. I'm not going to give you loads of slides. This is the slide. If you can achieve everything that is on this slide, or a fair proportion of it, you are well down the road to implementing an internal controls framework that, if you operate effectively, will become effective and will deal with any challenge that you get from any external regulators, external audit, and other stakeholders in your organisation. So going back to basics, we've recently had the output of the consultation with the Restoring Trust in Audit and Governance in the UK. So for UK businesses, if you are public, private, charity, public sector, anything like that, if you have over 750 employees and you have more than an annual turnover, so that's not profits or anything like that, that is your revenue stream. So if you are a public sector body, your funding stream is over 750 million, you need to sit up and you need to pay attention, because you will be impacted either through changes to the Combined Code of Corporate Governance or through the Companies Act, because you are considered a PI, so that's a public interest entity. So just to reiterate, 750 employees and over 750 million of revenue, you're impacted. So these are the things that you need to think about. On top of links to all of the webinars, so the 3 previous that have been done and this one, we will also be providing you with a 2-page handout that you can take to your boards, your senior management, or you can use as an aid memoir internally. And this is the culmination of all of my experience since I moved into the internal controls field in 2007. So we're looking at 14 years of it. I've worked predominantly for US listed businesses, so that takes into account the Sarbanes-Oxley piece, but also I have put this together based on the UK requirements. Sarbanes-Oxley, so Megan mentioned a lot about internal control frameworks in session 2. That was very US perspective because they only look at internal controls over financial reporting. The UK reforms that are happening, the CEO and the CFO are going to have to make statements on their internal control framework. That means it is your financial and your operational controls. This is bigger than your financial statements. Be aware of it. So for those of you that have joined, that are in the internal audit space, everything that you do, because you do tend to look at a lot of non-financial areas, all helps your CEO, CFO to make those assurance statements. So let's look at scoping. So I've included in the handout for you a number of questions that you need to ask yourselves and your business. Who provides your governance oversight? Do you have an audit committee? Because if you don't, why do you not have an audit committee? Because the audit committee is only made up of non-executive directors, people that are not involved in the day-to-day operations of the business, and they are the ones that are there to keep management honest and to ask those challenging questions. They are there to represent your stakeholders, not your shareholders. Do you have a risk committee? Do you understand risk, which I'll come on to in a minute? Do you have internal audit? If you do have internal audit and it is totally outsourced, have you actually tried to outsource accountability by outsourcing your head of internal audit role? And that's a question that people need to ask themselves, because you are relying on a third party to provide you for assurance on your internal control framework. Accountability has to sit within the business. So who does that person report to, and who's driving what's included in that internal audit, annual audit plan and strategic audit plan? And do you know if you are effectively controlled? Where does it come from? And that's where I go on to assurance mapping. Every organisation has multiple lines of assurance. So management will do reviews of activity. So we all know about balance sheet line item reconciliations for those of us who sat in the finance space. That is the level of financial assurance. Who's reviewing quality, health and safety, environment? If you're in production, manufacturing quality, protection of your assets, so robots and things, IT security, internal controls, internal audit, they are all assurance functions. Where's your overlap? Where's your gaps? And what you should be doing is mapping that to your key strategic risks and your operational risks. Because if you are not managing a risk, then you've got a gap and you need to fix it because you can't provide assurance. If you are over assured because everybody's looking at the same thing, you have an ineffective business. And all of this leads up to the fact that you've got reliance on your financial statements and people need to be looking at that. But there's also the new things that are coming in, such as resilience statements. So who's going to provide assurance over your resilience statements? Now, in the initial paper, they were talking about corporate auditors. Myself and an awful lot of people went back and said, you've already got that. You've got internal audit, use them. So as internal auditors, for those of you that are in that space, you need to be involved in this. You need to be having these discussions, because if you are not at the table, and therefore are you relevant? And if anybody's heard me talk in the past, relevance of internal audit is really, really important. So I've put some questions for you to ask yourself in the handout that will be coming later on that you need to ask about assurance mapping. I'm going to move on because I'm very conscious of time of the webinar, because one of the areas that I really want to focus on is management accountability. One of the things over the course of the reforms that are happening in the UK, we need to think about how we train managers. When Sarbanes-Oxley came in, there was this whole exercise, and cost of compliance was humongous because everybody was documenting everything. We've already got it documented. But what we haven't done was we haven't highlighted our risks, we haven't highlighted our controls, because we have not trained our managers on what is a risk and what is a control. I am giving you information in the last section on what is a risk and what is a control and how to document it. But management own risk. The clue is in their job titles. If they are a manager, they are not just managing a process, because that's supervisory. If they are managers, they should be managing risk to help the business meet its objectives. And therefore, they have to understand what risk is. And therefore, they then have to understand what is a control and the importance of a control. So a question to ask yourself and your organizations, and hold that mirror up to management, to say is, do we actually train our managers in controls and risk? Do we have controls awareness training? And that is one of the things that has really helped with successful implementations of internal controls frameworks, is once you've got your governance structures, you then go straight into training your managers. Because when they understand the risks of their role and the importance of what they do and their upstream and their downstream impacts, they will then buy into why they need to manage their risks and why they need to manage their controls. Because there is no point in you documenting it and you testing it and then walking away. They own it, they have to do it. So it is our imperative to train these people in what we want them to do. So once they understand it, what we then need to be doing is looking at procedures. So for those of you that don't know, is SIPOC, supplier, input, process, output, customer. Do your procedures follow that route? Because if they do, the elements for the controls which are important in your processes can be easily defined. And one of the things that I would like to point out is policies and procedures are not controls that are effective in their own right. And in the classroom, when I'm training people, and I know a couple of people are on the call that used to work for me, will know, I always akin this to the highway code. We all sign up to the highway code, which is our policies and procedures for driving vehicles. It doesn't stop us speeding. It doesn't stop us breaking the law. We have to have other controls in place to mitigate the risks of us not following the policies and procedures. So you need to have them in the right format, because they are used as a training tool. They give people the governance and the framework in which to operate. And if you can then, when you start reviewing your policies and procedures, especially your procedures, start pulling out the controls. When you are externally reviewed, or you are reviewed by internal audit going forwards, they will say, yeah, their controls are clearly defined and they are known. So that's really, really important. So I'm now going to move on to the last point. So this is a massive run through of 30 years worth of knowledge. A control. It is an action taken by management, either people or systems, because we don't live in a fully automated world. People are our control weakness, because people can do things wrong. However, we need them. It must be performed on a repeatable basis to manage risk, which is why a policy and a procedure isn't an effective control. And it should increase the likelihood that goals and objectives will be met. So we are managing risk, upside as well as downside, and we are making sure that our goals and objectives are met. That's the easy definition. If you can explain that to a manager in the business, they can get it. And there are 5 rules which are documented in the handout that you will get, so you can take them away. It must have a purpose. If the control has a purpose, it will make something or stop something happening. And it should be there to manage risk. If it's not managing risk, it's not a control. If it's not making something happen or stopping something happening, it's not a control. It must have a trigger event. It must be able to be executed the same time every single way, every time it is performed. Otherwise, it is not a control. And it can't be a policy or procedure. You should never, ever accept policies and procedures as effective controls. So, also included in the handout, what you will have is the 10 design principles. And when I've worked with organizations implementing internal control frameworks that work, if you can identify these 10 design principles, one of them is optional, and document it, you will again be able to pass any external review. Management will understand what is being required of them. They know how it will be measured, and they know what evidence they need to have to support their controls. So risk, I've got a load of questions there for you. I'm not going to go through that. Objective, we've covered. Owner and operator, understand the difference. Only one person can own a control, but you can have many operators. You need to know the activation date. I'm not going to go into that now. Input and frequency. You need to know where the stuff's coming from. Can you place reliance on it? And that goes on to, I'm going to jump down to my point 9, which is your information source. And I have loads of questions in there for you about spreadsheets, system generated reports. All of this has been around in the public domain since AS5 came out. All of these 10 points, if anybody ever says to you, it is a new requirement, it is not. It is something that we should have all been documenting, knowing and understanding since 2007. But having it in this easy checklist, you can create these checklists, you can educate your managers and get them to document what they do, how they do it, how long have they been doing it that way, what evidence do they have, what do they do with exceptions. If you don't know what you do with exceptions, you don't have a control because you're detecting stuff, but you're not correcting it. Computer says no is the UK tagline for that, I suppose. Tolerance and estimations is another one to call out. So one of the things that auditors always come back with is management review controls. All management review controls are is because there is judgment and individual human consideration in the way that those controls are performed. If you can document the tolerance levels for those controls, the estimation process that you will go through. So if it relies on an estimation, how do you estimate and the assumptions? So you document them. So then your management review controls operate the same way every time. And if you are going to change your assumptions or you're going to change your estimation process, you document why, when you changed it, so you have predictability of operation. If you can do this, you will go far and you will do well. And the last thing is I want to go back to, and I'm sorry I'm overrunning slightly, is in the COSO framework, which there is an extract in the handout, there is an internal controls maturity model. We will never get to a level 5 in any organization. That is when you are highly optimized. You need to have a single ERP system and minimum people involved in your processes. That's never going to happen because it's cost prohibitive. So what you should be doing is you should be targeting, you want to be a good solid 4, and in some of your more automated processes, pushing to a 5. So that is the quick run through on how you implement a successful internal controls framework. You have the people within your businesses to do this. They have the knowledge. They just don't know how to articulate it, to pull it out, to document it, to win and be successful in this space. Thank you. Mark.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much for that, Julianne. You shared some invaluable practical steps with the audience today, some tangible actions that they can take forward in order to make a positive impact on their internal control environment, and also a bit of guidance in terms of what to what to do in what order, what things they should be prioritizing, what things need to come before other things which they may otherwise have dived into some of the detail before actually getting some of those governance structures in place, and some of those important bodies you mentioned around the audit committees and things like that. So that's fantastic. In terms of questions, we didn't have any that cropped up in the into the chat or the Q&A, which means everybody gets it, which is great. But if there are any questions that that come in later on, feel free to send them over, and we'll do our best to answer those as well. So yeah, we've come now to the end of our UK SOX webinar series. I'd like to take the opportunity once again to thank Julianne and all of our other guest speakers for their valued contributions to these discussions. And thank you also to those members of the audience that have joined us. I hope you've managed to get some further clarity around the topic of UK SOX, as well as some value from the sessions themselves in terms of next steps to take from a planning and execution perspective. As I mentioned earlier, you'll be able to access all of the webinars on demand shortly, and there'll be some emails going out with links to those on-demand recordings. In addition, the 2-page summary that Julianne mentioned, that will be coming out to you shortly also. So some real practical and tangible takeaways that you can have with you going forward. If you'd like to discuss any of the content covered today in further detail, please don't hesitate to reach out to myself or to Julianne. It just leaves me to say thanks very much for joining, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.